Hello and welcome to today's webinar, 7 Key ECM Changes, a look ahead to 2017. I'm Teresa Resick, Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And with me today are John Mancini, AIIM's Chief Evangelist, and we also have Auntie Navala of M-Files. And M-Files is the underwriter of today's webinar. We thank them for their support, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. As we get started here, I have the About AIIM information slide up there, but I'm going to speak to you just to offer a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinar live, you can customize your own viewing experience. Feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows on your screen. Across the bottom of your screen is a list of all of the widgets available to you. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list that's to the right side of the screen. There are also a few other documents and links in there for some really good resources and some good papers, and just to help you learn more about what we're talking about today. Feel free to ask questions throughout the hour using the Q&A feature. We will hold these until the end, where we will have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them, but you can also use this feature to comment or ask for technical assistance. At the end of this webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and I'd greatly appreciate it if you would take a few moments to offer your feedback and suggest other topics for us to cover. You can also access this survey in the list of widgets across the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to you in replay form very shortly. And now I'd just like to take this opportunity to introduce our speakers today. Very pleased to have both these gentlemen with us. First up, I'd like to introduce John Mancini, AIIM's Chief Evangelist. And John is an author, speaker, and a respected leader within the AIIM global community of information professionals. He is a catalyst in social, mobile, cloud, and big data technology adoption, and an advocate for the new generation of experts who are driving the future of information management. John predicts that the next 3 years will generate more change in the way we deploy enterprise technologies and whom we trust with this task than in the previous 2 decades. And also joining us today is Auntie Navala, who is the Chief Technology Officer of M-Files. And Auntie is a respected software industry veteran with 20 years of experience. He created M-Files' first software product in the early 1990s. And the product's success provided the early funding for its new flagship product, M-Files Enterprise Information Management Software. Auntie conceived and co-created M-Files and continues to lead the development of the product in addition to managing the rapid and profitable growth of the business. So right now, I'm going to turn things over to John Mancini to begin his talk today. John?
Great. Thank you, Teresa. It's a really interesting time, I think, to be in the content management space. And I've been doing this for about 20 years at AIIM now. And I was reflecting on this, just thinking about those 20 years. And during those 20 years, I think we've been through what I would view as 3 major eras in document and content management. And so the first one was document management and workflow, that era during the 90s. And you know, when I think about the challenges that people face with people and process and technology, you know, at the time we were focused on applications that were mission critical and document intensive. These were very complex implementations, and they really only touched very few people in our organizations. And we migrated into this enterprise content management, or ECM, era, in which we started to view content as a layer within the organization. A lot of the sales of content management systems shifted to the business, and we started to get some pickup within the broader knowledge worker space, but still was, you know, it was mainly the realm of specialists, if you will. And then this last era that we're in right now, mobile and cloud era, is one in which, you know, the business has all sorts of power to deploy solutions, sometimes without even any intervention of IT staffs. You know, I think about the impact that Salesforce and the cloud has had on how people view enterprise systems, and it creates a real premium on usability, on simplicity, on ease of integration, and those kinds of issues become much more paramount moving forward. Now, the challenge, I think, for organizations, as you think about this, is that most organizations at scale don't have the luxury of just moving as seamlessly as I just implied from one era to the other and leaving what they did in the previous era behind. These eras are stacked on top of each other. And so the challenges that people have are tied, particularly in larger organizations, with this question of, okay, I've got this accumulation of systems, this accumulation of repositories. I've got all sorts of options available to me moving forward, and where do I go from here? And so this where do I go from here question is really on top of everybody's minds these days. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One of which is, when Documentum got bought by OpenText, it kind of signaled for a lot of people, a questioning and asking questions about where they were and what their strategy was and where they were trying to move forward. It was sort of a symbolic thing, if you will. And then just yesterday, I was with Hans Kühler-Kroner from Gartner, and Gartner has decided that they are going to retire the term enterprise content management. They're not saying that ECM is going away, and they're not saying that it's unimportant. In fact, they're saying it's more important than it ever was, and that the term doesn't fully do justice to how important it is. But nevertheless, it signals change, and it signals that there are some things that are coming that are different than the world in which we've existed for the past 10 years or so. So what I thought I would do today is take 7 of those, and really fortunate to have Antti here on the call today. It's not every day I get on the phone with the founder of a company, and a significant company at that. And so I thought we'd split up the agenda a bit, and I would tee up each of these points, give a little bit of background, often using some of our industry data to illustrate the point, and then have Antti give a little bit of a real-world perspective on each one of those points. And so that's the format that we'll take as we move through this. I mentioned Gartner earlier, and in their most recent Magic Quadrant, M-Files is the only company in the visionary status, and so in the visionary quadrant. So it's really exciting to have you guys here today. And so without further ado, let me hop in and just walk through, like I say, for each of these points, give you a little bit of a sense of context, and then tee up the point, and then get some commentary from Antti about it. So the first point I wanted to tee up is, I think we've finally awoken from this dream of a single repository. I had somebody recently say, are you sure it's a dream, John, or is it some sort of a nightmare that we've had that we actually even thought that it was possible to have a single repository? And when I look at our industry data, you can see some of the facts on the screen here, is that, the fact of the matter is that most people have multiple systems. Many have way more than, 4, 5, 6. Some have as large as 15 or 20 different content systems. This definition of ECM is getting increasingly blurred. People are understanding that, the term itself has served us well, but it's not fully encompassing what people are trying to do. And I think people are starting to understand that, particularly in organizations at scale, while you want to have a simpler content management strategy and a simpler content management capability, you have mission-critical systems that rest, particularly transactional-oriented systems that rest on existing solutions that you don't lightly just rip out. And yet at the same time, you have this question associated with, all right, you've got many knowledge workers that have to plug in to content management capabilities, and they can't plug into capabilities that are very complicated or difficult to use, or they won't use them. So the first point I wanted to tee up is this idea that we had this fantasy, if you will, that everyone would drive into a single repository 10 years ago. And the reality, I think, for most organizations as they think through this, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, is that there will be multiple repositories, and the strategy they have to determine is how they are going to deal with that. So let me turn it over to Antti at this point and get a couple of get your take on that point and what it means for end users out there.
Thanks, John. And yeah, that's really a key point that maybe this single repository objective has simply been wrong, and by trying to achieve that, we have kind of ended up with just adding more and more systems when we were thinking we would be like consolidating. But it's not only that; it's not just taking a new ECM system and adding it to the ECM stack. It's also that we simply have content everywhere. We have content in email or in the CRM system, in addition to the kind of the real ECM systems as we've learned to know them. So I'd say there are very good reasons for having multiple repositories, and we just need to rethink ECM or the role of ECM in a way that it helps the organizations and the end users deal with this reality instead of like fighting it and trying to get people consolidate into a single repository and eventually maybe making every user reasonably unhappy because that kind of a single system will not serve anybody particularly well. I think this realization in all of its simplicity, it's very important.
I think that notion of rethinking ECM in the context of the current reality, that's a really important thing. It's not easy for many organizations to do because they have a vested interest, and not easy for a lot of vendors to do because they have a vested interest in the status quo. But I think that rethinking point becomes really, really important moving forward. So second data point I wanted to tee up is, and I mentioned earlier these three eras of ECM, going from document management and workflow to enterprise content management to mobile and cloud. And across those three eras, a progressive embracing of the end user, if you will. And yet, there are still many solutions that haven't quite gotten there in terms of really being appealing in terms of their usability. When we do surveys, and these data points that are on the screen right now are from people that have content management systems. And so, we ask people about this, and 22% consider their ECM project to be stalled. And I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of it ties to that second data point about user adoption issues. And it points to Antti's point, I think, earlier about, we can't dictate to people how they interact with our systems and with technology. We have to have a much more flexible approach. This second data point, 52%, say that they're still dependent on their network file shares. If there's I think this is the most disturbing data point in a lot of the research that we've done. Having been an advocate for content management for a long time, these are people that deployed content management systems, and yet they said they still were dependent on their file shares. And for me, that points to the challenge that many vendors and many systems haven't addressed this core question of usability. And it ties to the very last point particularly, is that many solutions were late to the mobile game. And so as the revolution was going on in mobility, it's reflected in this point. It's gotten a lot better in the last year or so, to be honest, since we did the survey. But still, there's a lag there in terms of many solutions, in terms of their usability on mobile devices, and not just phones, but on any device that moves around. And so when you think about the overall trend, I think what you have is that in the early stages of content management 10 years ago, these implementations were driven by IT, and they were driven at specialists, and they were driven particularly at large companies. And more specifically, they were driven at departments at large companies. And so now what you have is a very different composition. A lot of these implementations are being driven by end users. They're being driven by business people, line of business people that realize that they have a need for geographically dispersed workers to connect with each other in a very meaningful way and find the information that they need. And then this last point on here, relevant to companies of all sizes, is really, really important because there is a huge set of companies in the mid-size market and even in the small market that haven't even touched these capabilities yet. Huge opportunities for automation and for better collaboration. And so as we think about this, Antti, your perspectives in terms of how the focus and the driver, if you will, of this industry has changed over the last 10 years.
Well, yeah, definitely there's been a big shift from kind of that IT-driven systems to end users and business users actually asking for requiring systems that will help them do their job better. And I think that's one of the reasons why we also have this multiple repositories reality that previously when looking at things from the IT point of view, it made sense to try to get everybody do the same. But when you look at it from the business user point of view, you want the best tool for your specific work area, whether it's your legal department or your sales team. And that leads to different choices. And the role of ECM should then be somehow to integrate and bring content together and available for everyone, regardless of the system or location, instead of kind of fighting back. That point you made about those file shares on dependency on network folders, I just want to kind of confirm that based on our customer talks, and especially when we talk about our new approach, which I will touch on a bit later more. But it's just kind of when we have spent a few minutes talking about it, then kind of everybody seems to come to a point that admitting that actually there are those network folders where we still have so many documents, kind of we don't know how to do that. So if there's one thing, then that's something that we as ECM vendors need to solve in the near future. That's it's a shame we are there, but it's also a great opportunity.
Yes, definitely. And I think when you think about this in the context of compliance, this is my third point, is that compliance is getting much more challenging than it once was. And, when we ask people, what has been your experience in terms of having problems, you can see from the data that, 51% have had some data-related incidents in the past 12 months. Just yesterday, there was a massive Yahoo breach that they discussed in the news. And organizations are challenged with dealing with the massive growth that's going on in the volume of information that they're trying to manage and putting some sort of a responsible framework around that. And so what you can see in these data points is that people want to do this. They want to handle information in a more responsible fashion. They're still doing so in a fairly manual way. And, many have very, very good intentions, but the reality, and I think it's because in many instances the systems have been so difficult to use, in many instances they've failed, because and that opens up the organization to all sorts of exposure. I think about this particularly in the context of the GDPR, for example, and think about the challenges that poses to organizations in terms of managing the privacy and security of their information. And that's just one example. It's one that is particularly on our minds right now. But that's going on everywhere. That's going on all sorts of national governments and regional governments and industry bodies establishing compliance needs and requirements that are specific to their particular needs in an environment in which the volume of information is growing geometrically. And that combination of rapid growth of information and increasing requirements means I think you have to think through the compliance question differently than you did before. So, and that gets me to my third point, is that I think previously we tended to think about compliance in the context of a particular process and approached it process by process by process by process. And I think what we're finding now is that compliance risks are everywhere. They're incredibly more complex. They transcend national boundaries, and yet they have national regulatory frameworks applied to those regulatory risks and to the volume of information that they're trying to deal with. So, onto your take on compliance. It seems like it's been with us for a while, but I think it's getting more challenging rather than less.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I had a good simple answer how to deal with it. It's definitely getting challenging, and one reason for that is the consumerization trend and how the end users basically demand the easy to use tools, which I think is a great thing, but it's also one of the areas where people then tend to just go and bypass any compliance rules or best practices that the organization is trying to set. And I think the key to success is to find that right kind of a balance of control and ease of use, because if you make, for instance, sharing content outside of your organization prohibited or just very difficult, then people have tools to bypass you anyway, and they will then use something that you have no control of. But on the other hand, you just don't want to be all open. You just have to find that balance where your end users will be willing to kind of act within the perimeter that you are setting, and they feel they are getting the ease of use they deserve today. And of course, this is a much broader question than just sharing content, but that's maybe a good example.
Yeah, and I think it's been so interesting. Once we, in the early days, we were able to, just set up these huge walls. And we assumed that if you were inside the firewall, you were safe, and we were trying to keep the barbarians from coming over the wall. And as soon as we opened up our organizations to mobile technologies, that idea of perimeter-based security really changed to one where you've got to view this, I think, as you said, through the prism of how do you mitigate risk, and how do you manage risk, and how do you take a very different approach to security than you did as recently as 10 years ago.
Indeed, it's kind of almost like admitting that you will maybe leak something, but you rather leak one document than all of your ECM content. And another key thing there, I think, is the thinking of compliance and confidentiality of content from the point of view of what that content actually is. So not from the system perspective or from the perspective of location, but more like attaching it to the thing of what you are managing, and not by which system you're managing it.
Yep. Very key point, I think. So my fourth point is this ties directly to all of that, which is the cloud. And there's a couple perspectives on the data that I have on the screen that I just wanted to comment on. And the first one is that if you note that first point, there's a bigger point hidden away in that first bullet, which 87% of the individual survey participants we spoke with are positive about content in the cloud, but only 42% of the organizations they work for. So there's a lag in many organizations in which they understand that they have to at some point incorporate the cloud into their strategies. In many cases, the incumbent decision makers are much more comfortable with on-premise systems. The reality is that there's some things that are appropriate on-prem, there's some things that are appropriate in the cloud, but that people need to have the cloud as some part of their strategy moving forward. And so one data point that I think that we've actually made some progress on is helping people understand that when you deal with people that are dealing with large volumes of information in the cloud at scale, that the odds are that they're probably better at security than thinking about the old data room, in the back of an organization. And so this 75% feel that security by cloud providers is likely to be better or the same as their own servers is a significant step forward, because if we asked that question 5 years ago, we would not have gotten that answer. So the net of all this, I think, is that, and the cloud is not for everyone, it's not for everything, but it is a key part of every strategy, I think, moving forward. And so 10 years ago, this was something that was just fantasy land and nobody would have ever even considered it. Now, like I say, it doesn't apply to everything. It doesn't apply to everywhere. But everyone wants to have that cloud option as they deal with vendors and as they deal with strategic decisions about their systems moving forward. And so your take on how receptive is your user audience to cloud-based options at this point, Antti?
Yeah, John, the data point you had about how the individuals are so much more willing or ready to go to the cloud than the organizations, that's really interesting. So why do you think is that? Why are they just more modern than the organizations they work in?
I think there's a lag in most organizations. 2 points. One is that I think what we do in our consumer lives, we tend to be much more willing to try new things, I think, than, if you're an organization at large scale, it's not a trivial decision. If I as an individual decide to do something in the cloud, it doesn't carry very great weight to it. If a 20,000 employee organization decides to do something in the cloud, it does. So I think there's a certain conservatism in organizations that takes a while to overcome. So I think that's the explanation for the lag.
And kind of what I started thinking there is that, of course, for any individual, any of us as a business user, we can think about the content we manage and say that that it doesn't sound like too dangerous if my content is in the cloud. But when you are making those decisions on the organization level, then even if you have 1% of your content that you're not willing to put to the cloud, then of course you will hesitate. So kind of it's a very different question from a one individual user point of view than from the organization point of view. And I think that we are maybe making a mistake as vendors if we make it too black and white and say that now it has to be all cloud, because we're actually slowing down this transition by doing that. I think cloud is great, and that's definitely the future, but the way to get there is to use the hybrid model, and the way we think about content management of managing content by what it is and not by where it is. I think it's from our point of view, it's very natural to think that it shouldn't matter to the end user whether the content is in the cloud or on premises, or if some content is in the cloud and some is on premises. And by having this kind of a hybrid approach, I think we can bridge this gap in between the users and the organizations, and just let the organizations keep some of the content on premises, at least for some years, and we'll see whether the future will be all cloud or if it continues to be hybrid. But let's not make it too black and white.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It is a hybrid world. Organizations need to have strategies that are flexible enough to embrace that hybridness and not force people into decisions that are inappropriate to where they are at their particular point in time in their particular organization. So I also just remind everybody we do have a question tab, so we'll be getting to questions at the end. So if you have some questions you'd like to ask, just tee them up there, and we'll get to as many of them as we can during the course of the conversation. And if we don't get to all of them, then certainly the M-Files folks and the AIIM folks will follow up and get you your answer that you're looking for. So my fifth thing that I wanted to talk about is that during most of the time that I've been doing content management, we've focused on trying to store content and basically trying to take paper out of processes, push information into digital form, keep it in digital form once it's in digital form, and basically put it someplace. And so I think where we are right now is that there is an inflection point underway, and I think M-Files is in the middle of a lot of this inflection point, which is that there's two things that are changing. One is, I think, less focus and less desire to focus on where content is, but more focus on what it is and what does it mean in the context of a business process. And then secondly, a desire to extract more information from that content and inject it into our business processes. And so, much more interest in analytics. Sometimes analytics is, a term that, gets people rolling their eyes because they think it's way too complicated for where they are. But what I'm trying to drive at here is that we've gone from an environment in which the focus was on storing content to actually using that content and extracting insight from how people use that content. And for me, that's what analytics is ultimately all about. So your take, Antti, on that in terms of how your customers are engaging with that point.
Yeah, I like the way you use the wording of insight instead of just talking about analytics, which is maybe sometimes too difficult to understand. So really, again, this is some of the legacy of ECM of kind of being the replacement of the physical filing cabinets that we've just been more like glorified filing cabinets for years and haven't maybe yet done enough in actually getting or extracting value out of the content we are storing. And I think that's a massive thing for M-Files, but I think it's massive for everybody that now there's a big change going on, and ECM is becoming intelligent. It's about understanding the content that we store and helping the user be more productive thanks to that. So it can mean smarter search, system recommending content to you. It can mean automating some tasks you previously had to do manually. But all in all, it's just this difference that we think about the ECM system as not just the storage place, but actually as a tool that will work with you on the content itself, and not consider it as just as a binary file.
Yeah, it's funny, Antti. We've had conversations at AIIM for the last couple of years, and AIIM is AIIM, which stands for the Association for Information and Image Management. And particularly the image management conjures up the focus on storing content. And so one of the conversations that we've had, I don't think they've gotten to the point of acting upon it, but thinking about, okay, well, maybe we don't want to change the acronym because branding is always hard to change. But, do we really represent now the Association for Intelligent Information Management? And that idea of, information has intelligence. People want to extract that intelligence, and they want to gain insight from that intelligence. And so I think what you talk about there is really important.
Yeah, I like that thought. It's you got my vote for that kind of a name. Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's just do it right here on the webinar, and then we won't tell anybody, and we won't have to get a. All right, my sixth one is this idea of really dramatic changes in how content is created, how content is used. These data points are actually from Hans at Gartner during the course of our meeting. I thought this was kind of an interesting thing, and it's the idea that content creation has been consumerized. Content creation has become fragmented in terms of multiple types of content, multiple resources of content. And so I think the implication of this is that it changes how we need to view the starting point for a project. And so, ECM has this long legacy. And gosh, if I had a dollar or a euro for every time I have heard a story of a massive migration project that just bogged down under its own weight, I would be a wealthy person today. But, that's been one of the challenges, is that, when you start, and it ties to that very first point that we talked about single repository versus multiple repositories. And so, when you think about this, and if the starting point is that you think that you have to massively migrate stuff, it's kind of no wonder that people have been somewhat resistant to some of the things that we've been trying to get people to do. And so this idea of how do you rethink this? How do you view it in a different fashion than we did before? And how can you start small and accelerate as you build success? And, we've always struggled with this question of metadata. And I think one of the insights that you all have had that I'm really intrigued at is this idea of, okay, well, how can we put metadata at the core of the problem and rethink our approach, moving from a massive migration approach to a much more nimble and agile kind of an approach. So talk a little bit about that and talk about how you guys view the centrality of metadata in this challenge that people have.
Yeah, it's been a kind of an evolution for us that when we started building M files, our thinking was that it needs to be that content management or information management needs to be based on what the content is and not where it is stored, and that kind of, for us, it meant that it can't be based on a folder structure. It needs to be based on metadata. So kind of this metadata-based thinking, building the M-Files platform with a fundamentally metadata-driven architecture. That was our starting point. But actually, to be honest, it's been only like in the last couple of years that we have kind of realized that we have been missing one big thing, and that's been the being too tied to this single or this storing the content in our own repository. And once we realized that actually that's not the right way to do it, then we realized that how much power the metadata approach or the metadata-based approach has when you think about managing content across different repositories. And then that further led to the realization that actually if we start managing content independent of its location, letting it be in its original repositories, we can actually solve one of the biggest hurdles or stumbling blocks of the ECM implementations, which is precisely this massive migration project. So if we can actually offer the value of ECM to the end users without requiring the data migration, then we're gonna make a big difference. So I personally believe that that's going to be one of the biggest changes in ECM in the next couple of years, when we see kind of, hopefully we can accelerate ECM becoming more widespread in organizations when we make it easier by just removing that hurdle.
Antti, was there any particular tipping point or epiphany that drove you guys to sort of rethink the centrality of metadata versus the single repository approach? Anything in particular that galvanized that?
We had a project where we talked to a good number of large companies, especially in the US, where we basically said we are not trying to sell M files to you, but we want to hear what your biggest information management challenges are. And the message they all told us was this, that they have too many systems already, too many repositories already. So it's kind of almost like all of them said us directly, and some actually did, that if you are trying to sell me yet another repository, I'm not interested. But if you can tell me how we can better deal with these information assets and information repositories that we already have, then let's talk. And once we had done our homework and we realized kind of what it means to import, that led us to the realization that we call it being repository agnostic. But that kind of was the tipping point for us, that we realized that we've been basically trying to sell the wrong thing.
Interesting. I like that term, repository agnostic. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of changes is that I think there's we talked earlier about end user experiences and how it impacts how we've viewed content management systems. And I think also end user experiences when it comes to apps and applications have really changed how we view enterprise solutions. And so, again, at the meeting that I attended yesterday, we were talking about this question of, well, what is so different about apps, and particularly apps on our phone, that gets us to like them so much? And so it said to me that there's, first of all, there's a lot of choice. Secondly, is that when you live life in a mobile device, it's always there, it's always on, it's always available. Apps are usually vetted, fairly well, so you don't have to necessarily wait in the queue in order to get served. They're focused, and they focus on doing a couple of things very well and in a very elegant fashion from a design perspective. Updating occurs in the background, and basically you can go from device to device to device, from a mobile to a tablet to a PC and back again, and you can do it in a Starbucks, or you can do it in your office, or you can do it at home, and you have this device independence. And so it struck me that one of the big changes that we're in the middle of is that, when we thought about business processes 10 years ago, they were big bang, boil the ocean deployments, gigantic, processes that we were trying to automate. And what I see people trying to do now is something that's much more nimble and much more agile. And so they're trying to think about, how do I put in place a content strategy that allows my business owners to be much more innovative and much more agile and much less waterfallish in terms of development strategies, and basically be freed to get applications much quicker to market. So this question about how processes have changed and the interaction between process and content, any perspectives that you have on that?
Yeah, if there's something I hope these mobile apps as well as the cloud have kind of taught us that we could also embrace in the on-premises environments is this practice of just continuous updates and your mobile app getting updated without you thinking about it. You will actually you would get angry if it didn't. But in many of these enterprise software systems on premises, we are creating big problems for us with these upgrade projects and kind of accumulating those changes. So hopefully this mindset of continuously updating mobile apps and cloud apps also comes to the on-premises world. Kind of everybody would learn to work that way. I think it will be a much more pleasant environment, not only for the end users but also for the IT, who currently maybe has to take the blame of those pains of upgrading to a new software version.
So I'd like to turn the microphone over to you for a few minutes, Antti. I've been very intrigued by some of the work that you've been doing with this idea of an intelligent metadata layer. So let me turn it over to you, and I'd really like to hear a bit more about that and understand it a bit more.
Thanks, John. Yeah, my pleasure. I tend to get a bit excited when I talk about this topic, so feel free to interject. So anyway, I already alluded to some of this previously. So this is a typical IT landscape especially in a larger organization, but actually even in smaller organizations. We have those network folders. We have Dropbox or Box accounts and maybe something like SharePoint or who knows, thousands of SharePoint sites and document libraries. So in a sense, multiple repositories, lots of information silos. And how we now see this at mFiles is that in order to solve this with ECM, we, as I previously said, we shouldn't go and say that here's my new ECM system, move all your data and content into my repository, and then you will have better usability and you will have mobile access and workflow capabilities, and everything will be better as long as you move all of your data into my repository. That's just the wrong approach. We believe that the next generation of ECM, or whatever we then end up calling it, is based on these couple of key principles. So first of all, I strongly believe that it has to be metadata driven. It can't be based on that outdated folder paradigm where you try to do a single hierarchy of folders to like express the kind of content that you have in your business. We think about content as I've said maybe already many times, that it's important to manage it by what it is and not by where it is. And metadata is the key there. So folders are about a physical location, whereas metadata is describing what the document is. It's a contract. It's related to this customer. It's expiring on that date. And that's just a fundamentally better way and more objective way of managing content. And when we extend that thinking beyond the repository, then we realize that mFiles should be repository agnostic. So we shouldn't require users or organizations to physically move the data or files into our repository in order to get the benefits of metadata-driven content management. Instead, we can actually think of mFiles as a layer on top of these other systems that can manage that content with metadata by creating the associations between something like a document or a file on a network folder and a customer record in, say, Salesforce CRM in the cloud. So there's actually nothing there that requires you to move that content anywhere. And third about making mFiles or the ECM system intelligent and making it understand the content it's storing. And I have a couple of examples of what that mean. But I as a CTO of mFiles, I tend to look at this from the kind of the software architecture point of view, and kind of it's just easy for me to explain that when you think about an ECM system like mFiles, so previously it was all about being that repository, but now the new thinking is that you connect your network folders, SharePoint sites, your other repositories to the mFiles backend, and that way we get immediate benefits, like for instance mobile access to all that content through the mFiles mobile apps, because anything that's connected to the backend is available through the kind of the unified user experience layer that mFiles can bring. But maybe even more importantly is that middle tier there, the intelligent metadata layer. That basically it's the new layer that manages the metadata for content, even if it's physically residing in another repository. And that also then enables the kind of the, well, here's hopefully a good illustration of that. So it means that when you're accessing the ECM system as an end user, you don't need to think about where the content is, because the system and the UI is showing you the content regardless of its location, and it's showing you how it's related to each other. So this is this has similarities to enterprise search, but it goes way beyond because it's actually using metadata to establish those missing contextual relationships between content and data. And here's just an example of what the intelligence aspect means. So instead of just storing binary files like photos there without understanding any of it, there's a lot of interesting, very fascinating technology now available to do content analysis. Here's an example of what we can get out of just an ordinary photograph. With the computer vision technologies, we can even get this kind of a human-readable caption description for the text, so for the image. And in our customer cases, it's maybe typically more about managing text-based documents, but this kind of an example hopefully kind of opens the eyes for seeing that it's not just about keyword search. There's now so much more that these new artificial intelligence technologies are bringing us.
Yeah, and if you can do this on an image, imagine what you can do with a text document.
Indeed, indeed. And I'll close my part by kind of just focusing on that, almost like the result of this new approach, that when you layer AIIM files or the ECM system on top of your existing repositories, it means that you don't need to migrate the content. You can keep your existing files in the file shares or in your legacy ECM repositories if you want to, and you can have part of your users start using it through the AIIM files layer, while others still use it through the old system. And okay, I understand that typically then eventually we want to shut down some of the old systems. That's typically desirable, but the key is that you don't need to do it overnight. You can do it gradually, and it's such it's just how much better that is from the point of, for instance, managing risk. That's a huge change. But yeah, that's just a couple of quick thoughts on what the intelligent metadata layer means and what we are, how we are approaching the future of ECM. I hope you would go and download our white paper about this repository agnostic approach to ECM. I think we do our best to explain this approach in that white paper.
Well, thank you. We've been listening to Antti Novola of AIIM Files and also with John Mancini of AIIM. And with this white paper that is listed up on the screen right here, it is there for you to download right now. If you go to the right side of the slide area, there's the resources list. And just please click on any and all of those links right now that's in the resources list. They'll just open up in a separate browser tab. You won't lose connectivity to the webinar itself. And after the webinar, you can save off all of these documents. AIIM Files has contributed some really good documents in here. In addition to this paper, they provide a complimentary copy of the Gartner Magic Quadrant ECM report. And so that's a really good resource in there. And also AIIM Files offers a guided tour. And certainly a copy of the presentation is in that resources list as well. So we have a lot of really good questions that have been coming in, and I have a feeling we're going to go a little bit long today because I really want to get to these questions. So Antti, I do want to ask this first one of you. Someone is asking, will AIIM Files read the metadata of other ECM systems?
Great question, and absolutely. When we connect other ECM systems that are metadata capable, AIIM Files will absolutely surface that metadata through the AIIM Files layer.
And in addition, with the metadata, does it help negotiate all the different classifications? Does it support the folksonomy and ontologies that may be in other systems?
That's a fairly broad question. So the metadata that AIIM Files can manage can indeed serve the purpose of creating that kind of content or metadata hub across those repositories, so it can help establish that kind of a unified basis of metadata for the organization. But I think it's also important to realize that that there will be specific purpose metadata in the underlying repositories, and you don't need to try to map all of that into M files. You can think of this as kind of maybe a higher abstraction layer. That's one of the powers of when you are not migrating content. You don't need to do like 100% migration or 100% mapping. You can just pick some of the most valuable pieces and use that.
Antti, another question for you. How far along are you with this intelligent metadata layer? When will the system be available?
Yeah, we are working really hard to get it to the customers, and we are getting close there. We are currently in pilot implementations with our first close cooperation customers. And this is going to be generally available in the first half of 2017.
Okay. And I do have a question here for John. Back in the section when you were talking about the cloud and information in the cloud, and that not all of the business information is right to be in the cloud, someone's asking for your thoughts on what should be in the cloud, what should not be, what should be considered hybrid, just some business approaches or some tips to help guide people for how to manage their information.
That's a good question, and unfortunately, there's not really like a right answer, which is what makes things, I think, a little bit complex. Is that, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think people's risk profiles are different from industry to industry, from country to country. They're different based on how big your organization is or how small, and so I think you have to reach those conclusions, based on the context of your particular business and your particular corporate culture as well. I think the option now that's different is that, by having a hybrid approach, it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. In some ways it might be easier if it was, but it probably is less useful to people if it was, very arbitrary. So, this idea of managing content by what it is rather than where it is, and this idea that organizations are going to have a hybrid approach to the cloud, I think is healthy, and I think it's good, and I think it reflects some of the points that Antti was talking about the need to evolve your systems rather than rip out and migrate your systems. And I think this idea that you have to have an evolutionary approach is really important, particularly in large organizations.
Thank you, John. We have a lot of very technical questions for M-Files, and I'm going to try to squeeze a few more in here. So, Antti, someone is asking, how does the intelligent metadata layer classify and extract the information from the files stored in these other platforms? Do you have a connector to these external platforms, or can you offer just a little bit of information of how that works?
First of all, we have an open framework of connectors to these external repositories. So while M-Files itself is providing some of the connectors, we are already working with a few key partners who are providing a much broader selection of connectors to all the kinds of repositories you can imagine. And the second part is how to extract information from the content of the files. That's another area where we have both our own but also third-party partner-created components that we call metadata providers. Basically, we are harnessing the latest and greatest available AI technology and text analytics technology, whether it's NLP or machine learning based, and we are kind of combining and putting it to work in the context ECM. So it includes automatic classification. It includes things like named entity extraction and other text analytics technologies. But it's kind of it's a combination of a number of technologies that we believe we can bring to the end user and customer in a really valuable package.
Another question here for you, Antti. Are you considering exploring enterprise search based on the same metadata-driven approach? Is that something in mFile's future?
Yes, it is. And actually, I think that overall in the industry, if and I'd like to say when we are moving to this direction of seeing ECM as more as a layer on top of the physical repositories, I believe enterprise search basically becomes a feature of ECM. That's how I see it. Maybe enterprise search folks see it the other way, that enterprise search evolves into more like ECM. I believe that these two industries, like enterprise search and ECM, will become one in 1 or 2 years. You will not necessarily talk about those separately. So mFiles is definitely addressing that too.
Thank you for that. I realize we've run a little bit long here, so I just want to just mention a few other things for you here today. John, do you want to share a little bit about what's coming up with the AIM conference?
Just quickly, since we're running late, I think that picture is actually of me, that little tiny person in the on the stage there. If you haven't been to the AIM conference in the last few years, it's brand new. It's 5 years old. I know a lot of people know the AIM show from the old days, but it's not anything like that. This is a user-centered conference focused on best practices with particularly an eye towards the next 18 to 24 months. And so would really like to invite our European community to be a part of the conference. We had a big crowd last year in New Orleans from Europe. I think we'll have the same thing again in Orlando. It's a good opportunity in March to extend the trip and get a little vacation time too. So please join us.
Thank you, John. Just as we are at the end of our webinar time here, I just want to thank our speakers, John Mancini of AIM and Antti Nevela of mFiles. Also just wanted to let everyone know we have recorded this webinar, and we'll let you know in the next day or two when this replay information is available, because there's a lot of really good information shared today. Don't forget to download the resources that are onto the right side of the slide area. And also, I value your feedback and would appreciate your taking the survey that will open when the webinar ends. Very much want to thank our underwriters, mFiles. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM wouldn't be able to bring you these free educational programs. So thank you for your support and contributions, mFiles. So as we do come to close with our webinar, I want to ask each of our speakers for their closing thoughts or a key takeaway. And I'd like to start first with Antti Nevela of mFiles. Your closing thoughts today.
It's about how difficult it is to implement ECM in your organization. So hopefully some of the thoughts I shared today will make you think and help you think that whenever somebody is now talking about that massive migration project and how difficult it's going to be to move to ECM, that you've heard about the better way, and there's something happening in the ECM industry that's really gonna change. So keep that in mind.
Thank you. And John Mancini of AIM, your closing thoughts today.
Sure. Just two. First, thank you, Antti, for being on the call. I do a lot of webinars, and it isn't all that typical that I learn a lot along the way. So I really appreciate the insights that you brought to this call today. Second thing is, I think that there's a temptation when Gartner talks about retiring the ECM term to think that content management is becoming less important. And I think it's actually, and if you kind of probe what Gartner's saying, it's actually directly the opposite. In many ways, this is the golden age of content. Content populates just about every customer experience you can possibly imagine. And so, one of the reasons to retire the term is it's not big enough. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we move forward, is that whatever we wind up calling this space, it's becoming more and more critical to both customer and employee experiences, and I think that's really exciting moving forward.
Thank you, John. And I know that we had more questions than we were able to answer, and the folks from NFiles or AIM will definitely be getting back to you, especially NFiles will, with those technical questions. So thank you for submitting all of that you have. And thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. For AIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you on our next webinar. And have a great afternoon.